bet like me you thought tanks and armoured vehicles had replaced Britain's horse-mounted cavalry after World War One. Well, we were wrong.
It was going to be our first taste of action, wondering what it would in fact be like as a mounted unit in a modern role, in modern warfare role.
In many cases they were the frontline troops because they're at the front of the columns doing the reconnaissance.
They were fighting in mountainous countryside with very deep valleys, narrow paths and fast-flowing rivers.
And they weren't expecting to have to use cavalry. No one expected cavalry to be any use. But all of a sudden they're discovering that these cavalry can operate more than a tactical band, in some cases a day or two ahead of the main forces.
Imagine this, in 1939 Britain still had a number of cavalry regiments that hadn't been mechanised. Yep, they still rode horses and, amazingly, carried sabres. These were territorials with no real place in modern warfare. Yet by 1941 they were riding into battle in Syria, leading patrols, swimming rivers under aircraft attack, and somehow rewriting the book on cavalry warfare. They actually proved to be incredibly important. Well, today we're joined by the brilliant Jonathan Washington, a former yeomanry soldier himself, and author of Fighting Vichy from Horseback. It's a cracking book all about a division that wasn't really meant to fight, Britain's first cavalry division in World War II. The division's story is full of the unexpected. We'll talk about how the ragtag group of horsemen, many of whom had never ridden a horse before, overcame not only enemy forces but Whitehall's own disregard. And in the end they even proved Churchill wrong, because believe it or not, these mounted soldiers played a critical role in the Middle East campaign. It's a thrilling and frankly bizarre saga of a division that wasn't supposed to fight, but ended up making history and proving that maybe cavalry still had a role on the modern battlefield. I started off by asking Jonathan to give broader context of cavalry use by the main combatants in World War II. Was it that rare?
But if you look at, say, the French army in 1940, they got cavalry in action. The Germans and the Soviets, loads and loads of cavalry. Again, like most military historians, I was aware the Germans had lots and lots of horse-drawn transport, and that's always held up as the irony. So you've got your Panzer division streaking ahead, but then you've got the rest of the army plodding along on foot with horse-drawn transport. Same in Russia. Yeah, that's true, but they also had a lot of combat role cavalry. They had a whole division which invaded France, having previously invaded Poland, and having fought against Polish cavalry sword on sword.
That's incredible.
And then you've also got the fact that each German infantry division had a mounted reconnaissance battalion. They called them battalions, actually it was about 200 men and horses. And their role is to screen, to flank, probe ahead reconnaissance patrols.
But what of the British? How did we still have horse-mounted cavalry in World War II? What's the story?
World War One happens. The British don't use cavalry very well in World War One. Principally haven't got enough of them. And Haig is the best book for this is David Kenyon's Horsemen in No Man's Land, but very brief summary. Haig always assumed they were there to be an operational breakthrough, like there's a big gap. You send through massive of cavalry, and this is your strategic breakthrough. And actually, they're much more useful for small-scale, local tactical breakthroughs where an infantry battalion has broken through, and that's where you need people who can move much faster than infantry to quickly seize that gap. So cavalry, obviously.
Yeah.
Tanks come in. Tanks are not a replacement for cavalry. They're too slow for a start. Tanks are essentially mobile machine gun positions. And to give you an idea of that crossover, when they worked out best how to use tanks by, say, 1918, tank company commanders were all mounted, because that was the best way of getting around from tank to tank the battlefield to brief them clearly and communicate his intentions to them clearly. So that's the first point. And the reason I mention this is it shows that the technology isn't really there properly to completely replace tanks at the end of World War One. They've got some armoured cars, yes. They're not that great. They've got some tanks, yes. They're incredibly slow. And they're not designed to replace cavalry. And so in 1920, the decision is taken, right, we're going to phase out our cavalry. We'll do it later. And that remains the case through until 1942. And it takes a major European war, and even then, that doesn't completely do it, to actually get most of the units mechanised. So from 1939 to 1942, there are still mounted units on the Albad.
During that period, of course, a lot of the regular cavalry regiments were being mechanised. But of course, there was not enough vehicles or tanks or even guns for all. The yeomanry regiments were great family regiments, and they wished to stay together. And provided we were allowed to stay together and we had our horses, we were prepared to go on, probably thinking that some time would come when we would become an armoured regiment.
In the 1920s, for example, a lot of the regular units are getting mechanised, but you need to replace them. You can't just take them off the strength and leave a big hole. You need to actually fill that hole with armoured cars and what have you, which involves buying them. You also need to be upgrading them. You can't just put in stuff that's 15 years old or 10 years old. You actually need to make sure what you're replacing with are decent, and they are doing that a bit. Tanks take a lot of developing, and they are mechanising. But the British are very bad at mechanising quickly because they're not really developing armour that fast. They're doing it a bit, but they could be much, much quicker. But broadly speaking, in the 1920s, there's not the political will to completely overhaul a section of the army and put lots of investment into it. And then in the 1930s, there's not the cash to do it, because any money that is being spent in the armed forces is being spent on radar and Spitfire and fleet escorts. It's not being spent on the TA's cavalry.
Yeah.
And so you get to 1939, most of the regular army, his cavalry, has been mechanised. One or two bits here and there the yeomanry have, but you've still got over 9 regiments that are still designated to be horse cavalry, and none of them assume they will ever have to fight on horses, because everyone's always said, you're cavalry for now, so play along with being horse soldiers, and later on when it all hits the fan, we'll mechanise you, if not before, but it will happen some point in the future.
So we've got the mechanisation then. Obviously, as you say, there's a number of regiments who are still to be mechanised when war breaks out. And this is the crux of your book, really. I mean, one of the units you talk about a lot is the Cheshire Yeomanry.
Yeah.
I'm interested, what sort of men made up these units? Were they sort of local rural folk who, were raised in the saddle and this was the natural role for them? Or were they just trying to sort of make do and make it up as they went along with city boys and anyone else? What were they like?
The former point is a reasonable assumption, and you would expect that. The officers certainly were. The officers typically were almost exclusively from the rural gentry. They'd known each other growing up, and they'd been hunting together, all the rest of it. You've got all sorts making up the other ranks, town and country, what have you.
It was a peculiar experience. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'd never been on a horse before, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. There wasn't a question of the old-fashioned riding master with his whip. The NCOs that taught us how to ride were very good, very efficient. They just sat us on the saddle and told us what to do, let us get on with it. And it's amazing how quickly one learned.
Like the rest of the TA, there's a chronic lack of funding, and therefore a chronic lack of recruitment, because there just isn't the interest in the TA, and that becomes visible, and people are quite happy to do weekend soldiering because it's fun, but it's not because they're seriously intending never going to war in that particular unit.
Yeah.
And so recruitment and retention TA is dreadful. It's so obviously not a priority. By 1938, the TA is seriously dwindling. So we've got Chamberlain latterly deciding, like late in the 30s, 1938, deciding that actually he is going to have a land force that can fight in Europe alongside the French. Though, to be honest, it's the French army that's a cornerstone of British defence policy rather than the British army. It means that he wants to build up his land forces quickly and cheaply, and that's always going to mean TA rather than regulars, because obviously they're cheaper. And so suddenly funding does go into the TA. And with that, interest and enthusiasm enters the TA, and people start joining the TA. And in 1938, people know there's a war coming.
Yeah.
And the people who realise quickest there is a war coming are obviously the sharp ones. And also, there's a lot of guys who have heard about the trenches from their fathers, They do not want to be in the infantry when war comes.
Yeah.
So they look for artillery units, signals units, etc., etc. They also look at yeomanry units because they know, because everyone's been saying, official policy is that the yeomanry will not stay as mounted cavalry. So they join the yeomanry on the very reasonable assumption, because they've been told as much, that they'll get put in some other role, like signals or artillery, or that the yeomanry units will simply be mechanized.
Yeah.
And so you have a lot of really switched on characters. You've got nothing to do with horses, joining the yeomanry, joining mounted units, 1938, 1939, loads and loads of them. And they make up, they're pretty much half the strength by the time that the balloon goes up in September 1939. At least 50% of the yeomanry are young townsmen. They didn't have any interest in horses before joining the yeomanry. There might be clerks, they might be builders or tradesmen, for example. And yeah, they're sharp and they're switched on. So the quality of the manpower in the yeomanry is fantastic.
Yeah.
But they're not really skilled horsemen. And because a lot of them joined actually in April 1939, they've had a few weekends of training between April 1939 and September 1939. And that's their training on horses and soldiering. Put it all together, and they probably got 20, 25 days worth of training, and they're suddenly classed as operational.
Wow. Now, like me, I'm guessing you love military history and you can't get enough of Britain's incredible past. If so, then sign up for my newsletter. It's completely free, and you'll even get a bonus, a free ebook I wrote all about the legendary Battle of Isandlwana. Want more? Well, for exclusive content and a totally ad-free experience, head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/redcoathistory. Whether you choose the free or paid tier, you'll be supporting more great stories from Britain's military past. And finally, don't miss out on swanky merch like these t-shirts on screen now. Who doesn't want to impress their other half with an Iron Duke t-shirt? Alright, back to the action.
This country is at war with Germany.
September 1939. Suddenly all these guys are called up and they get formed into a division and shipped off to the Middle East, essentially, don't they? Obviously, I've shrunk that story down a little bit, but can you tell us how that ended up? How did these guys end up being sent out to the Middle East, and what was the plan for their use at this point?
As with everything, every decision made about the yeomanry, nobody ever intends them to end up doing what they're doing. So the yeomanry is mobilised, and much to everyone's surprise, they're mobilised with their horses as well. When I say their horses, horses are purchased to equip the yeomanry with. And they have a division worth of cavalry. Great. So they're technically operationally deployable. What are they actually going to do with them? There's no intention to deploy them on the continent. The British army that fights on the continent is the most modern army there is in 1940 on the continent, because the French, for example, have still got loads of cavalry. The Germans have got loads of cavalry. The British are the only one that's fully mechanised. The yeomanry, therefore, they want to keep them away from the fighting. And they're trying to work out where to put them. Do they just keep them in the UK and mechanise them there? Well, they're not going to mechanise them anytime soon because they haven't got the vehicles to do it. So, thoughts. And they remember that out in Palestine, of course, they've got 2 or 3 regiments of regular cavalry, essentially operating as mounted police because the terrain requires it. And they've always been there, done a pretty good job. And they can get away with just using mounted police there, but that's fine. There's an effective operational role for them. And so they basically decide to send a division of TA cavalry out to replace that handful of regular units, who will then come back and be mechanised, and they'll be operational effective much quicker. And this division of yeomanry that will then be out in the Middle East, they can first of all keep the area secure and make sure there's military presence. And then when the vehicles eventually become available, sound familiar? When the vehicles eventually become available, they will then be trained up on them. Because in Palestine in 1939, 1940, there's no threat. The French are an ally still. Italy hasn't declared war yet. There's no real threat to Palestine. So why would you have tanks and artillery and things out there?
So then when they do get out there, obviously, like you say, at that point, there's no threat. but pretty soon a threat develops, doesn't it? With the fall of France and the rise of the Vichy regime, suddenly you've got enemy troops right on your doorstep. So how did what was the situation then, for anyone who doesn't know, what was the strategic situation in the region, just briefly, with the Vichy French? Because I think a lot of people aren't really aware of the whole Vichy French thing.
The political settlement between France and Germany is that technically France has surrendered to be an ally of like a lesser partner to Germany. Technically, of course, it's actually just been conquered. It means that the French Empire, which includes Indochina, which includes Morocco, includes bits of West Africa, it's all over the world. The French Empire is still technically an asset of France, run from this place called Vichy, hence Vichy France. Of course, it's a collaborative regime. It's just a puppet regime run by the Germans, and part of their empire is what they call Syria, which is modern day Syria and Lebanon. That borders British Palestine. British Palestine being modern day Palestine and Israel. It's all one block of land called Palestine.
Yes.
And so essentially you had that threat of this French and by extension German satellite bordering a British colony. And that colony, Palestine, is all that therefore stands between Axis powers and the Suez Canal, because the Suez Canal is where Britain's oil and supplies, etc., en route to India and all the rest of it comes from. And also there's oil in the Middle East, like coming out of Iraq, for example, that the British obviously depend upon to fuel their tanks and their ships and their planes.
So suddenly these guys have gone from being sent to a backwater where they can't do any harm to actually now being in a very important strategic location.
Very important strategic location, and very quickly they start getting re-rolled. Funnily enough, they start getting changed into coastal artillery and put into tanks and this kind of stuff. Most of them, but not all of them.
I was about to say so, but obviously we've still got a number of those units remain on horseback. Now I want to look at some of their operations shortly, but one thing I thought was interesting that we can just touch on is how were these guys equipped? Like, you've got some good information in your book. I've got a note here, page 91, where you list all of the kit these guys would have carried. Could you maybe just give us a sense of what a cavalryman in World War II would have been equipped with and carried into battle?
The list of equipment is as follows. Item 1, 2 blankets, 1 each for horse and rider. Item 2, saddle wallets with rations, about two days worth of rations. You've then got rider's personal kit and spare underclothes, and either wallet or haversack. Standard. Great coat on front arch of saddle, ground sheet on rear arch, grooming kit, rifle bucket with mess tin attached. That means the rifle is attached to the saddle, not the rider. That becomes important later. 2 feed bags, shoe case with spare shoes and nails. That means they can reshoe the horse while they're out and about. Again, that's important because it means they can operate well away from the main column. Sword. I'll explain that in a second. 2 ground pegs, ropes and shackles. That means they can put them into open lines. For example, if you look at the picture that's on screen now, you can see the rifle and its rifle bucket. You can see all this kit. You've got a canvas water bucket, hay net and hopping on can, which is what we make tea with. That's it.
On here you have your wallets, which carries your personal equipment. Over the top of it you fold your greatcoat roll up. Along this side you have the shoe case and the sword. That's the sword. The horse and rider, when the rider had a complete kit on and the horse was in full marching order, you were approximately anything from 18 to 20 stone he was carrying.
They'll probably also carry extra rounds, I assume, for the boys' anti-tank guns, as it's actually called the boys, BOYES, and for them for machine guns as well. You will have remounts with them too. From an operational point of view, they're much more self-sufficient if they're near grass and running water. because then what do you actually really need to resupply them? It's not like they're burning through masses of ammo and constant firefights, because their role isn't to get into scraps.
Yeah.
It's to look to the enemy, it's to screen. You don't need to be constantly resupplying them with that. If you can get them operating away from the main column, then it's happy days. The commander doesn't need to worry about them too much. He's got this mobile, pretty self-sufficient screen on flanks and up front as well. I mentioned swords. When they are moving, they are the first ground troops that are going to come into contact with enemy. And so the point man of the point section of the point troop of the point regiment is always the first British soldier to come up against the enemy where you've got cavalry operating. And the point man has a sword, because these are bolt action rifles. And if they are traipsing around a mountain trail, they come around a corner and there's enemy there, he needs to straight away be able to react, like eye blink reaction, to take on whoever is immediately in front of him. If they're further away, then fine, he's got time to get his rifle out, cock it and fire. But it's a bolt action rifle, and so to operate it, it's pull back the bolt, put it back forwards, it's cocked, then you can point and fire it. You need something that will keep you protected for that first 1.5 seconds, or whatever it is when the enemy's actually in front of you. So if the point man has a sword and they're constantly rotating, you don't have the same man on point all the way through, and you rotate the point section, you rotate the point troop, point squadron, point regiment. The man covering him has his rifle out, and he's a tactical band behind. He's got a second or two to cock, aim and fire his rifle, and then you've got the rest of the troop behind them. But that's why they carry swords.
I find that incredible that soldiers would have gone out, advancing to contact with a sword in hand. That's that's incredible. In World War II, who would have thought it?
Yeah, crazy, isn't it?
Finally, the monotony of barrack life and police patrols was broken when in June 1941 they received orders to cross the border into Syria. They now faced a conventional enemy, the Vichy French, who were still allied to the Germans.
So now let's fast forward, June 1941. I've got the map up on screen now. The British decide to invade the Vichy region of Syria. Looking at this map, can you just tell us what was the overall plan, and then how were the yeomanry utilised, those cavalry soldiers? How were they utilised for this operation?
Yeah, go on. It's a good question, and the question is the fact they were there is generated by desperation, because you've had all this upheaval in the Middle East, and basically all the other units are being used. Either they're being used in Iraq, fighting the Iraqis there, or they're fighting in Greece and Crete, etc. And some of the very last units left were cavalry units. They didn't have many vehicles, right? So that's why I mentioned this, and it's important to remember that. If you look at this map, you can see the main strategic thrusts. You can break it down actually a little bit further than that. So going up the coast, if you look on the left-hand side, so from Accra, you follow the coast up to Nakoda, Iskenderun, up to Tia, crossing the Litani. There's a coastal highway, and that's pretty much the route that 21st Brigade, Australian infantry, that's the route they'd be taking. Go further inland, where the second Australian arrow from right is, that's pretty much where 25th Brigade are travelling up. And with both these brigades, there's yeomanry. You've also got more forces further across to the right, and you've got Free French way over on the right. And the Free French had cavalry as well. They had Circassian cavalry, and they had Free French Spahis too.
It was going to be our first taste of action, wondering what it would in fact be like as a mounted unit in a modern role, in modern warfare role. Of course, they found the ideal job for us, because what in fact we did was we acted as flank guard to the Australian infantry battalions. They were aware that the French had some cavalry, Spahi cavalry, and we were to prevent them from coming down behind the advancing Australians and doing some damage. And I think that was the role we fulfilled.
Which leads us on to the opposition. There were nearly 40,000 French soldiers here, and they had decent armour. They'd run over 35 tanks, which were solid bits of kit. They were medium tanks. They were proper fighting proposition. They had a lot of artillery. They had all these experts, regulars, these Spahi cavalry, for example, from Morocco and Algeria and Lebanon, or Syria, as they called it. They got French Foreign Legion. They got a lot of quality troops there, and a lot of them. And so this British invasion that's there to preemptively take out French South Syria before it becomes a threat is, in the words of the splendid Colin Smith, insultingly small. It's pretty pathetic, really. You've got big deal, a brigade of infantry with a few horsemen going up the left hand side. You've got a brigade of infantry with a few horsemen going up the middle, and then you've cobbled together a few other brigades and some Free French to go up the right. Later on, when the Iraq campaign had wound up a few weeks later, then they were able to come in from the north, and that's one of the things that turns the tide. But basically, there's not too many routes an invader can take from the south, because the ground is so hilly and rocky and steep. Vehicles just cannot operate anywhere but in certain valleys. And so the French know there's only about 3 or 4 options that the British and Australian invaders can come up. And lo and behold, that's what they move up. And Wilson, in many historians' opinions, makes the mistake of spreading his main force, invading force, across 3 different columns rather than just concentrating on one.
Yeah.
But it means he's got 3 main thrusts travelling south to north. They're going northwards, and each one of those columns is going up ground that is it's a bit tricky anyway, but it's flanked in many cases by mountains, and his vehicles are not going to operate at a gradient on mountains like that, and there's huge boulders in the way. Infantry move pretty slowly, so this is the perfect ground for cavalry. And they weren't expecting to have to use cavalry. No one expected cavalry to be any use, but all of a sudden they're discovering that these cavalry can operate more than a tactical band, in some cases a day or 2 ahead of main forces going up. They can scout ahead, that they can check out the Litani River, tell them where there's crossing points. And they can move much faster than a man on foot, and they can cover ground, most of the ground, that vehicles just couldn't get across.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting point, because in your book you even talk about the Australians kind of forming their own mounted unit, which they called the Kelly Gang. It seems that mounted troops were springing up everywhere. The French were using them, the Brits had their yeomanry units, and now the Aussies were jumping on the bandwagon. What does that really tell us about? I mean, we've kind of touched on it really, but it tells us, I think, how important these guys were proving to be.
And how important they were was a surprise. I think, if you look at the minutes of the very first planning conference for this invasion, Operation Exporter, they decide that actually they're probably going to need a squadron of horsed cavalry to accompany this invasion force. By the time that conversation is ended, they realise they're going to need to deploy an entire regiment of horsed cavalry. And so the invasion starts with horse cavalry, with 21 Brigade, 25th Brigade. As it continues, they bring up the rest of the 5th Cavalry Brigade. So because they need to cover that ground. And as these columns go further north, they get separated from each other. And so the ground in between them needs to be covered. And the only troops who can cover that ground are cavalry. They need more of them. So you're only a couple of weeks to the campaign, and you've got Cheshire Yeomanry, North Somerset Yeomanry, and the Yorkshire Dragoons. You've also got your Free French cavalry, and they need more horsemen. So this is where the Kelly Gang come in. They go to the Australian 6th Divisional Cavalry Regiment, who are, by the way, mounted on Bren carriers. And they say, Bren carriers are fine, they do certain things, but they ain't going to cross this ground. We need more cavalry. Now, a lot of you guys were light horse regiments before the war. How many of you can ride? And they take, I think, about 50 volunteers who were all essentially territorial cavalrymen in the 30s, who grew up sheep farming, etc. And these volunteers who are currently serving in this what's called the 6th Divisional Cavalry Regiment, which is its mechanised unit on Bren carriers, they've been fighting and defeating French units, so they've captured horses off of French Spahis and Circassians. So they have all these horses, and it's easy enough to get saddles because there's remounts floating around, and there's the captured kit as well. And they need more horsemen, so they they put these guys who can already ride and who are doing a reconnaissance role, they stick them on the captured horses. And the Australians, being Australians, call them the Kelly Gang because they look like the gang of bushwhackers who hung around, bounced around with Ned Kelly in the Aussie outback, and they do exactly what all the rest of the cavalry are doing. They cover ground the infantry can't do. They bridge between the various columns that are getting further and further separated. They scout ahead. They protect the flank.
They were fighting in mountainous countryside with very deep valleys, narrow paths and fast-flowing rivers. Horses were ideal for the task. However, they were vulnerable to air attack.
I was with about 6 horses right up against a cliff. So we were on a road and there was a cliffside, and I got right into the cliffside. We saw these 2 planes come over and we thought they were one of ours, but they were French, they were Vichy French. And the next thing, they spotted us, and down they came, firing their guns. And well, I got as close as I could. Mind you, I think the men in front had gone on in front, of course, and they must have taken cover. But I was left with these horses, and the bullets were really, flying around. And I expected any minute we were going to be hit. You're a sitting target. But luckily, anyway, I wasn't.
The way the campaign pans out is that, rather predictably, the columns that have been sent up on the left flank and the centre flank stagnate pretty quickly. The original plan was for, in the first 48 hours or so, the entire force to reach both Beirut and Damascus. Okay?
Yeah.
That's the 2 capitals, the Lebanese capital and the Syrian capital. They are, you can see Damascus out on the right here, but Beirut isn't even when you keep scrolling up, and it takes ages to find it. And that's the plan. See?
Yeah,
and
it
the
is.
The reason they thought it'd be so easy is because they assumed that they assumed that the Vichy French would maybe fire a couple of rounds in token gesture and then welcome their noble allies. That's what Churchill assumed. It's what de Gaulle assumed. Wavell, he seems to have, the guy who finally got bullied into ordering this one. He kind of half believed it, I think. And they didn't. They fought. They really fought. So very quickly, these units stagnate. If you go down the middle column, which is 25th Brigade, which has got B Squadron, Cheshire Yeomanry, after 5 days, it covered 10 miles. Now, you're only doing a lot of work.
The second line in with the Australians, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. The Yeomanry the B Squad Cheshire Yeomanry are busy as they're buzzing backwards and forwards, but the main column has gone 10 miles in 5 days. That is not impressive. They very, very quickly get bogged down. There's French counterattack with armour and mortars. That defeats them at Mergy and has them almost retreating in chaos. Not quite, but almost. They're rallied and now there's some real heroism in that case from Australian infantry. You've also meanwhile got over on the right, you've got various British units fighting away. You've got an entire Fusilier battalion surrendering to the French because they're so badly mauled. It's going really, really badly at one point. And also they've only got something, I think it's 2 fighter squadrons and two and a half bomber squadrons against nearly 200 French aircraft to begin with. But more and more aircraft keep coming in, more resources get diverted in. They are able to withstand the French counterattack, and then more forces come in from the north, which don't have yeomanry with them. They've got guys who were yeomanry a few weeks beforehand, but got converted to trucked, basically to bust infantry to invade Iraq. They're coming in from the top right corner from the northeast. They go into Palmyra, etc. And so all of a sudden, the Vichy French now find themselves attacked on all sides. And about 6 weeks of fighting, the French surrender.
It's funny, isn't it? It's almost, I mean, I say, the word forgotten gets bandied around a bit easily, but it's certainly a campaign that is not one that is very well known.
No, it's not. And by extension, the very important role that yeomanry carried out in it is easily forgotten as well. And it's not like they were just there to carry a few messages around or to or to garrison ground that everyone else had fought over. In many cases, they were the frontline troops because they're at the front of the columns doing the reconnaissance. They had to fight their way across Litani at various points. And of course, horses can swim, so they can swim over rivers, scramble up the steep banks to the other side. There's mountains as well, so that gets in the way of radio signals. And quite often, the only way the Yeomanry units can communicate is by sending a galloper. That's where the famous Spencer's Ride comes in, that first anecdote that I stumbled across from the Yeomanry. And that's a dramatic tale in itself. So there's lots and lots of just different examples there.
I was just going to say, just because a lot of people won't know that, can you just sum that up in a couple of sentences to tease the book a bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. So this is the 21st Brigade coming up on the left flank. They need to find crossings across the Litani. They have to, because way out on the coast, where it says Colonel Pedder, he's leading a commando raid to seize a crossing across the Litani. They are stopped. Pedder is killed. They take horrific casualties. So inland, they need to find intact bridges. And the Cheshire Yeomanry are scouting ahead of 21st Infantry Brigade. This troop of cavalry, they're approaching the Litani River and they're trying to find bridges. They need to get an intact bridge that the rest of the brigade can get across. And 2 Troop A Squadron are on point. There's a photo taken by one of the men towards the back of the lead section. He's just taken a photo with his camera, and you can see them all just approaching the Litani. They spread out as because they're good cavalry. They don't get caught by shell burst or anything like that. They see this bridge. The machine gun troop, machine gun section, you've got just guns dismount. They're covering it. The lead troop approach the bridge. As soon as they reach it, of course, it's a moment of maximum danger. 2 of the troop cross it, and then just as the third set of hooves sets foot in it, machine gun fire rings out because there's a French Spahi machine gun team covering it, and the 2 horses that are on the bridge basically have to sprint across it because they want to get essentially underneath where the machine gun position is, so that it can't be shot at because the machine gun position is firing from that way, so that they gallop in underneath it. And that's 2 men.
Arthur Salter was following just behind.
With the high rock side of the ravine and the ricochets and the noise, it was quite frightening, really.
Then Corporal Spencer comes galloping across because the troop leader's across at this point, and Corporal Spencer knows that as machine gun section leader, he needs to get briefed by his troop leader, who has already galloped across the bridge. They're now pinned down. So they're pinned down on the north side with machine gun essentially above them, and the rest of the troop are under fire and returning fire from the other side. They're all dismounted. They're all banging away at each other. And the troop leader, Lieutenant Rogers, now has to get a message to Regimental HQ and in turn to the brigade. They have found an intact bridge, and they're working out a way to fight across it now. So he tells one of his troopers on his horse to swim back across the Litani, scamper up the other side and gallop away, which he does. Now he's only got a couple of maps of that galloper. He sends without a map, and then a few minutes later he thinks, hang on, I've just sent this 19-year-old without a map in country he doesn't know. Is he really going to get through? So he sends the reliable Corporal Spencer with a map to do exactly the same thing, to swim the Litani River, work his way out on the other side and gallop back to RHQ. And Spencer does do this. He works his horse along the cliff until he reckons he's at machine gun range. Then he exposes himself to machine gun fire, gallops his horse into the Litani, dives into it. Horse and man start swimming. The current is so strong that everything is swept off the horse, including Corporal Spencer. The saddle's gone, rifle, sword, everything. So Corporal Spencer, exhausted, scrambles onto the far bank, and he finds his horse waiting for him, just completely oblivious to the fact it's in range and sight of machine gunners, and everything's gone. There's no map, anything. So Corporal Spencer hauls himself out, climbs onto the bare back of the horse, and gallops off to RHQ rocks up an hour later, says, right, here's the situation. Meanwhile, the machine gun troop with Vickers guns has been galloping to the rescue, ready to take on the Spahi team. But by that point, Lieutenant Rogers' 2 troop have successfully got across the bridge. They've secured it. The Spahis have disappeared, and they have secured a bridge across Litani, which is like hen's teeth. It's like gold dust at that point.
On the 12th of July, the message came through that an armistice had been signed with the Vichy French. The regiment regrouped and proceeded to Beirut for the victory celebrations.
In general, were they effective, and how were they seen by the High Command? Was their effectiveness recognised?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first metric thing that sort of obviously shows how effective they were and how much the High Command appreciated them is the fact the High Command created the Kelly Gang. The fact that they were halfway into the campaign and they're saying, right, guys, any of you mechanised units, can any of you ride a horse? And they're re-rolling them, they're rehorsing them. And they were incredibly successful, but they were successful because they're in a very mountainous country. They were also good at reconnaissance. They came very, very close to carrying out a charge, actually, which they didn't actually need to got stood down at the last second. But they were exceptionally good at crossing ground. They could do it pretty quietly. They could do it without getting noticed. They could get a machine gun section like the one in the picture there. They could get a machine gun section up on top of a ridge very quickly and easily. They had much further range than a dismounted infantry unit. They could do all sorts of things really, really well. And they were using very much for screening, flanking, reconnaissance, the things they were originally intended to do. At the end of the campaign, there was still a theoretical risk, actually quite a serious risk, of the Germans succeeding in their campaign aims in Russia and then coming down south, sweeping south through Syria into Palestine. And at that point, having expressly thanked the yeomanry and said how successful they were, and there's letters showing that from the various commanders, they then think, actually, hang on, we need troops who can operate in Syria, in those mountains, to help us fight off the Germans. So they got the yeomanry, who are now these experts in mountain warfare. And the role they dream up for the yeomanry is to have them operating as saboteurs behind the German lines when the Germans finally do invade. So they equip them with mortars, they give them another machine gun troop in each regiment, they give them lots of mortars, and the plan is to supply them by airdrop behind German lines and basically do, I suppose, what kind of mounted partisans would have been doing against the Germans on the Russian steppe anyway. That's a plan. By the end of the year, by the end of 1941, it's become apparent the Germans have actually failed in their strategic objectives for the year. And so in early 1942, they're not going to need this force of saboteurs to stay behind and fight in the Syrian mountains. That eventuality is never going to materialise. They do need a lot of signallers. They're desperately short of signallers. So most of the yeomanry units are re-rolled as signallers, or they're just mechanised and turned into tank units.
And from your research, how did they respond to that? Because they've gone from, being tip of the spear, literally, to now being re-rolled as signallers. Were the guys pretty pissed off about that?
Big time. There's an element of fury at having to take on this supposedly undignified, un-cavalry role. But that mean that they were generally distraught as well. It wasn't just rage, because actually later on, when they rolled as they're in role as signallers, they've been trained up. It's a very important role, and they thrive in it. But at the time, it's a very, very emotional transition for them. And the other thing that makes it incredibly emotional for them is they have to hand their horses over. And these are horses they have literally been to war with. These are their pets. Who they took personal responsibility for in 1939.
Yeah.
And when these horses were compulsorily purchased from the civilian population in 1939, many of them came with notes attached to the bridle. There's one that says, I'll just read it out. It this was for a 7-year-old horse called Rufus, and there's a little note attached to the bridle. I can't quite find it. It says, Rufus, 7 years old, can be handled in and out of the stable by a child. Please be kind to him.
Wow.
And in March 1942, the guys who were handing over their horses to go back to the remount depots, in many cases to be shot. The soldiers are weeping against their horses' heads as they're feeding and watering them for the last time. The soldiers themselves are attaching notes to bridles saying, "Please be kind to him." A lot of them are saying, "This horse is used to being the centre of my attention. It may not take kindly to being part of a draft team pulling carts, because those which weren't shot were going to be used to pull GS wagons, general service wagons."
Yeah.
And it really affects the soldiers, and say you can see it in the notes they leave attached to their bridles. And there's this tragic diary entry from John Verdon. He describes the units as they say goodbye to their horses for the last time. He says that there are some moments that are so emotional they defy adequate description. And a cavalry regiment saying goodbye to his horses is one of them.
So the lads were re-rolled as signallers. Where did they spend the rest of the war? What can you just give us a brief outline of what they got up to next?
Yeah. So the North Somerset Yeomanry, for example, went to Sicily and Italy. The Cheshire Yeomanry, they were in the Sahara as signallers. Then when that campaign finishes, they don't go into Italy. They get trained up for use in Northwest Europe, and they're part of that force. They're essentially really just sort of managing the switchboards, the communications in sort of Belgium, which are not terribly keen on, because it's a bit boring by that point.
We were able to keep our cap badge, which was one of the marvellous, really, because we expected that we would have to wear signals cap badge, you see, and everything, but no, and we still kept our name, because we were known as the 5 LFC and later on 17 LFC Cheshire Yeomanry Signals, and we kept that name right the way through. That meant a lot to us, really did. Yes, really did.
And they're in that role until the end of the war, and then being the yeomanry, who are expert alcoholics, they have massive party time in May 1945.
No one can begrudge them a drink to mark VE Day. Good lads. Now, thanks to Jonathan for that. His book is available from Helion, and I'll put a link in the description below. If you like me covering World War II stories, please let me know in the comments so I can do more. In the meantime, YouTube thinks you're going to enjoy the video that's on screen now. I'll see you next week.